January 1991. America takes on a ruthless dictator named Saddam Hussein. The result? A stunning triumph.
I think we did this one right, politically and diplomatically and militarily.
But was it really a lasting victory?
We believe Saddam Hussein would likely be overthrown by his own military and his own people.
The inside story.
We left Saddam in power. It was a huge strategic miscalculation.
The questions and answers inside Desert Storm. Next on The Final Report. January 17th, 1991. Iraq. 2:30 a.m. Under jet-black skies, 8 Apache helicopters fly toward Baghdad. The Iraqi capital is home to almost 4 million people. As they move toward Baghdad, the United States and its allies will launch an overwhelming airstrike against Iraq. Iraq's dictator, Saddam Hussein, provoked the attack 5 months earlier when he chose to invade the tiny country of Kuwait. The U.S. once had a cautiously favorable relationship with Saddam. How did Iraq become an enemy of the U.S.? Navy ships stationed in the Persian Gulf launched Tomahawk cruise missiles toward Baghdad. Apache helicopters target key Iraqi air defense radar. Next comes an invisible destroyer. The F-117 stealth bomber is designed to elude a wide range of enemy sensors. Its jet-black finish and sleek contours help escape radar signals. The F-117s drop smart bombs on the city's most heavily defended targets. Iraqi gunners frantically respond by firing anti-aircraft guns at an enemy they cannot see. Desert Storm is underway. It begins with this airstrike, carried out by the U.S. and a coalition of 28 allies. How important is the coalition to the United States? CNN news anchor Bernard Shaw is at Baghdad's Al Rashid Hotel when he witnesses the start of the attack.
I just walked past the window. Suddenly I saw silver pieces just floating down out of the air. And then all hell broke loose.
It will be the first war ever broadcast live on television. As U.S. Secretary of State, James Baker knows what tonight's breaking news will be.
I sat there, I built myself a stiff drink, as a matter of fact, and I said to myself, what's wrong? The war was supposed to start 2 or 3 minutes ago. It was late starting. And then all of a sudden you saw the correspondents diving. I remember Bernie Shaw was one diving under the table.
As a reporter, you dream about wanting to be profound and utter a sentence that will capture it all. Profundity did not flow from my mouth in those opening seconds of the Gulf War.
The skies over Baghdad have been illuminated.
Baghdad is protected by 60 surface-to-air missile batteries and 3,000 anti-aircraft artillery guns.
The anti-aircraft batteries all around the hotels were firing, and they were firing at what they could not see. They could not see a stealth bomber.
From an altitude of 8,000 feet, Air Force Captain Steve Tate spots an unidentified aircraft tailing one of his fighter jets.
I lock up an airplane that's close to the ground, going very fast towards Baghdad, and I can't get a friendly ID on him. Sure enough, it comes up that it was a Mirage F-1.
An Iraqi fighter jet. In the first dogfight of the war, Tate downs the Mirage.
The missile impacted and had a huge fireball. You could see the airplane break up into about 4 large pieces.
In less than 3 hours, the airstrike delivers a crushing blow. By dawn, Baghdad is a smoldering ghost of a city.
You had factories burning, plants burning. You had the feeling that death was in the air.
Washington, D.C., 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. 8 time zones west of Baghdad, it is the evening on January 16th, when President George H.W. Bush addresses the American public.
Saddam Hussein started this cruel war against Kuwait. Tonight, the battle has been joined.
For 5 months, Saddam's forces have carried out the rape and pillage of Kuwait. Why did Saddam invade Kuwait? Now, in his 13-minute address, President Bush commits the United States to defending the tiny country. Iraq's invasion of the oil-rich nation has helped push the price of gas to an unheard-of $1.38 per gallon. In cities throughout the United States, protesters gather. They question the president's motives for waging war. Is this a war against an invading dictator, or a war for oil? January 17th, 1 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, 8 a.m. Saudi Arabia. At the U.S. Central Command Center in Riyadh, the initial hours of the Joint Air Campaign have been successful beyond expectations. General Chuck Horner, now retired, was the CENTCOM commander of the Air Force attack.
The first night was so successful, our struggle was to contain our euphoria.
The next day, that euphoria is shattered. Saddam widens the scope of the war zone. He launches Scud missiles toward the Allied air base in Saudi Arabia and at Israel. The Soviet-designed Scud is a ballistic missile. Although it can hold conventional explosives, its warhead can also carry chemical or biological agents. Saddam attacks the Israelis to provoke them into the war. He believes the Arab nations will refuse to fight alongside Israel, and the U.S.-led coalition will shatter. Early reports from Tel Aviv indicate that one of the warheads may contain chemical weapons.
We went after all the fixed Scud sites the opening night of the war. But we could not find the mobile missiles, and we didn't know where they were launching them from.
In order to keep Israel from retaliating on its own, the United States deploys the U.S. Patriot missile to defend Israel. The U.S. Patriot is a missile with the ability to intercept another missile, such as a Scud, in midair. But it's never been fired in wartime. January 18th. Dhahran, Saudi Arabia. A Patriot missile downs a Scud aimed toward the Saudi kingdom. Steve Kirrick, at the time a 24-year-old pilot, witnesses the Patriot in action.
As I looked over to my right, I saw a flash followed by what I would say the world's largest bottle rocket going skyward. There was no doubt it was a Patriot.
It is the first time a ballistic missile, such as the Scud, has ever been shot down.
To shoot down an airplane is one thing, but to shoot down a missile is a huge accomplishment. You can equate it to 2 bullets, hitting a bullet with another speeding bullet, and to think about that feat is quite amazing.
January 30th, 1991. 2 weeks into the war, General Norman Schwarzkopf is commander of American forces in the Gulf. He has an impressive combination of stealth and precision-guided weapons at his disposal.
I'm now going to show you a picture of the luckiest man in Iraq. Keep your eye on the crosshairs. And now in his rearview mirror.
American forces are using this precision technology to target suspected military command centers near Baghdad. Richard Wilhelm was a director of joint intelligence for the Pentagon. He recalls the difficulty of selecting targets near populated areas.
This is the first major combat operation where we had weapons that had the kind of precision that are needed. Precision weapons require precision intelligence, and that's very hard intelligence to come by.
Now, U.S. intelligence suspects that Iraq is using civilian air raid shelters as military bunkers. February 11th. Central Command, Saudi Arabia. Military commanders add an Iraqi air raid shelter to their list of targets. It is a large building located 30 miles southwest of downtown Baghdad, in the suburb of Amaria. February 13th, 4:30 a.m. Two Nighthawk stealth fighters aim at the ventilation grid on the roof of the suspected bunker. It is a direct hit. But daybreak reveals the strike has killed over 200 Iraqis, men, women, and children who were inside the building.
The signature for military activity was unmistakable. Saddam knew exactly what he was doing. He was sheltering his own people in there. My own opinion, I don't know we'll ever be able to prove or disprove this, we were set up.
There were efforts to blame it on Saddam. That's not clear. What was clear was that the United States had a big problem.
I don't know why do they hit children and old ladies. Why I lose my wife and my children? Is that fair?
I only hope that those who are responsible for this can be forgiven by God.
The bombing is the largest civilian disaster of the war and threatens to tear the coalition apart.
It was very clear that Saddam Hussein understood the coalition, particularly the United States, aversion to civilian casualties.
The pictures the next morning of the dead women and children and smoldering bodies created a lot of consternation among our allies and in Washington, and we all felt terrible about it.
The air assault against Baghdad, however, is coming to a close. The ground attack is at hand. That's next, when the final report continues. February 14th, 1991, Saudi Arabia. Over 700,000 Allied troops are preparing for a ground assault against Saddam's forces. It is the quiet before the storm. The soldiers write letters home and take care of last-minute business. The Allied forces have pounded Iraq with a series of precision airstrikes. Now the ground battle is expected to be much bloodier. In the face of such overwhelming force, how does Saddam expect to win? February 15th. Across the Middle East, Voice of America Radio airs a message from President Bush. He calls for the Iraqi people to rise up and overthrow their ruthless leader.
And there's another way for the bloodshed to stop, and that is for the Iraqi military and the Iraqi people to take matters into their own hands and force Saddam Hussein, the dictator, to step aside.
February 22nd. President Bush announces a next-day deadline for Iraq to withdraw from Kuwait and avoid a ground war. Instead, Iraqi forces set fire to more than 700 of Kuwait's oil wells. Acrid black smoke fills the skies over Kuwait. Saddam makes no move to withdraw. He masses his strongest force, the Republican Guard, along the Kuwait-Iraq border. He then increases his force in Kuwait with an army built of poorly trained Shiite Muslims and Kurds. Will these forces affect the outcome of the war? Norman Schwarzkopf is
the American general in charge of the ground attack. He must satisfy two goals of the Bush administration. 1.
Push Saddam out of Kuwait, and 2. Disable the Republican Guard. Saddam has the fourth largest military force in the world, with over 1 million men under arms. But only 10% are part of the elite Republican Guard. Why is it so important for the U.S. to destroy Saddam's Republican Guard? Schwarzkopf's plan is for the Marines to push across the Saudi border toward Kuwait City. Then additional U.S. and Allied forces will strike west of Kuwait and deep into Iraq. These troops hope to catch Iraq's Republican Guard unaware with a sweeping left hook attack. General Barry McCaffrey will help execute Schwarzkopf's maneuver.
Schwarzkopf devised a left hook which to go hundreds of kilometers out to the left or west, attack up to the Euphrates River Valley, and then hook back east toward Basra and encircle the Republican Guard divisions and destroy them. That was the plan.
McCaffrey's unit is the 24th Mechanized Infantry, a colossal division of tanks, Bradley fighting vehicles, helicopters, and crucial supplies such as fuel, food, and water.
So we ended up a better part of 26,000 troops. It was a fighting force that had more combat power than Patton's Third Army in World War II.
February 24th, 1991. Day one of the ground war. U.S. Marines breach minefields and tear through Iraqi forces almost unopposed. Marine divisions push 20 miles into Kuwait and take nearly 10,000 Iraqi prisoners. By the end of day two, General Barry McCaffrey's division has cut through 200 miles of Iraqi desert, defeating heavily armed Iraqi units. General Schwarzkopf declared the start of the Allied offensive a dramatic success. Part of this success is the surrender of 30,000 Iraqi soldiers. Why do so many of Saddam's soldiers surrender? February 26th, Saddam goes on Baghdad radio and announces that Iraqi troops are pulling out of Kuwait. But he makes it clear that for Iraq, the fight is not over. The band of infidels will ultimately be defeated, he says, and God's good people will inherit their land. North of Kuwait City, the highway that leads from Kuwait to Iraq is jammed with evacuating soldiers. According to reports by Kuwaiti resistance fighters, the Iraqis are leaving with weapons, hostages, and the spoils from Kuwait.
When the Iraqis decided to flee, they were taking a lot of military equipment with them. So we went in and put bombs across the narrow part of the highway.
Air Force, Navy, and Marine pilots trapped the string of vehicles by bombing the front and rear of the column. Then they target the traffic-jammed cars and tanks. They intend to stop the looting of Kuwaiti military equipment. But the images from the aftermath of the attack on the highway are brutal. The barren strip of road is littered with burned-out vehicles and an undetermined number of charred bodies.
The pictures of it were gory and stark. But in terms of loss of life, it was very low in that particular event. But it did affect a lot of people in this country.
In Washington, President Bush and his advisors learn about what will become known as the Highway of Death. What effect does the Highway of Death have on the administration's war strategy? February 27th, 8 p.m. Saudi Arabia. In a press conference, General Norman Schwarzkopf sums up the state of the war. The press quickly calls it the mother of all briefings.
But we have rendered completely ineffective over 29 Iraqi divisions.
Schwarzkopf declares that his forces have trapped the Republican Guard 30 miles north of the Kuwaiti border, near the city of Basra. He announces that Saddam's troops are near defeat.
There is no way out of here, there is no way out of here, and the enemy is fighting us in this location right here.
Is the Republican Guard still a threat? February 27th, 9 p.m., Washington, D.C. One day after the highway attack, President Bush calls for a ceasefire.
This suspension of offensive combat operations is contingent upon Iraq's not firing upon any coalition forces.
After a 100-hour ground battle, President Bush has effectively ended the war. But for some soldiers, the fiercest fighting lies ahead. That's next, when the final report returns. March 2nd, 1991. Iraq. President Bush has called for a ceasefire in the Gulf War. But Allied troops have not completed the job of routing Saddam's Republican Guard. In the desert, outside the city of Basra, 30 miles from the border of Kuwait, U.S. forces find themselves facing a division of Saddam's heavily armored Republican Guard units.
We had as much as a division worth of Republican Guards blunder into us. They fired on us, and in the ensuing short battle of 6 hours, we destroyed everyone inside my security zone.
It is more than 48 hours after the ceasefire, yet the 24th Mechanized Division has engaged in one of the bloodiest battles of the war. Has a ceasefire been called too soon? March 3rd, 1991. southern Iraq. Now spontaneous uprisings begin in southern towns, including Basra and Samawa. The people here are mostly Shiite Muslims. Saddam and most of his regime are Sunni Muslims and live primarily in the center of the country. The Sunnis and the Shia have engaged in bitter religious battles for over 1,000 years. For decades, Saddam's regime oppressed the Shia. March 5, 1991. The uprising spread to northern Iraq. Here the people are Kurds, an ancient tribe with its own language and traditions. Saddam has brutally oppressed the Kurds as well, and even attacked them with chemical weapons. Together, the Shia and the Kurds make up 3/4 of Iraq's population. Now, both factions believe the U.S. will join their fight. Saddam responds with the swift and brutal execution of tens of thousands of Shiite and Kurdish villagers. Loyal Republican Guard forces assault anyone perceived as a threat to the regime. Although President Bush encouraged Iraqis to rise up, the U.S. offers no military assistance. Why doesn't the U.S. military aid the uprisings? Within 6 weeks, the Republican Guard stamps out the rebellions. Saddam Hussein remains the clear and undisputed ruler of Iraq. Even though the United States and its allies have successfully liberated Kuwait, what kind of victory has this war achieved? By the end of April 1991, Operation Desert Storm was over. It wasn't until 2003, 12 years later, when American soldiers returned to fight in Iraq, that Saddam's regime was finally toppled. In hindsight, the decision not to oust Saddam in 1991, a time when U.S. forces were riding the crest of victory, has raised a number of questions. The final report answers these questions, beginning with America's reasons for launching the attack. How did Iraq become an enemy of the U.S.? Iraq launched an unprovoked attack against an oil-rich neighbor, Kuwait. Before Saddam's invasion, the U.S. considered him somewhat of an ally. The two countries shared a common enemy, Iran. The U.S. supported Iraq's 8-year war against Iran. Author Rick Atkinson, who covered the Gulf War for the Washington Post, says the U.S. developed a marriage of convenience with Saddam.
I don't think anyone had any illusions about Saddam Hussein as a proponent of democracy, but he was seen as someone who was fundamentally antithetical to Iran as an emerging power.
The U.S. viewed Saddam's secular government as a useful counterweight to the extreme Islamic leadership of Iran's Ayatollah Khomeini. From 1989 to 1992, James Baker was U.S. Secretary of State. Baker tells the final report about the U.S. policy toward Saddam.
We knew he was very unpredictable and very totalitarian and dictatorial and brutal, even to his own people. But it was in American interest at the time to make sure that Iran did not win the Iran-Iraq war.
Iraq's long and expensive war with Iran ended in 1988. It had ravaged the country's economy and left Saddam with an enormous and costly military machine. Saddam begins viewing his wealthy Arab neighbors with envy and contempt, which helps answer the question, why did Saddam invade Kuwait? To repay his massive war debts with Kuwait's considerable oil resources. Michael Gordon is the chief military correspondent for the New York Times. He explains the root of Saddam's animosity toward Kuwait.
Kuwait had loaned Iraq money to carry on their war with Iran. And Saddam's perception was, well, look, Iraq had fought the war against the Persians, had suffered all the casualties, and now here these Kuwaitis who had done nothing to help this war effort wanted their money back.
Saddam employs a public campaign of accusations toward Kuwait. He claims Kuwait is illegally drilling at an angle across the border into Iraqi oil fields, and also flooding the world's oil markets. Arab nations and the United States believe that Saddam Hussein is simply saber-rattling. But they are wrong. August 2nd, 1990. In the pre-dawn hours, 100,000 Iraqi troops surge across the Kuwaiti border.
This will not stand, this aggression against Kuwait.
And America goes to war. That's next on The Final Report. August 2nd, 1990. Just before dawn, Iraqi forces invade Kuwait. 1,000 Soviet-made tanks thunder toward the capital, Kuwait City. 6 a.m. Iraqi soldiers storm the emir's palace. Kuwait's small army is no match for Saddam's heavy forces. 12 hours after the invasion begins, Saddam Hussein achieves the successful occupation of Kuwait. Iraq now controls 1/5 of the world's oil. White House advisor Richard Haass is in a meeting with President George H.W. Bush when reports of the invasion reach Washington. Iraq's attack on Kuwait has dramatic implications for the U.S., coming so soon after the end of the Cold War.
If Saddam Hussein could be allowed to get away with this kind of brazen aggression just months after the Berlin Wall came down, what sort of a signal would it send? People, including the president, were very concerned that we would in some ways define this new era of history by what we did and didn't do.
2 days later at Camp David, General Norman Schwarzkopf and Lieutenant General Chuck Horner discussed the possibility of deploying American forces to the Gulf.
The president in that meeting asked basically two kinds of questions. One is, how do we limit the loss of life? And two, what do others think that the United States should do about this situation, particularly King Fahd, the king of Saudi Arabia?
The Saudi royal family was trembling. U.S. military officials say that had Saddam continued through Kuwait on into Saudi Arabia, the Americans, the British, could not have stopped him initially. That's how close they were.
If Iraq were to gain control of both Kuwait and Saudi Arabia, Saddam would have enormous power by controlling 45% of the world's oil supply. Was Operation Desert Storm a war against an invading dictator, or a war for oil? The answer is, it was fought for both reasons.
Here you had a case of clear, unprovoked aggression by a large country against a small neighbor. He had the fourth largest army in the world. He could have marched right down the Arabian Peninsula and occupied Saudi Arabia.
Also, the president was unwilling to leave nearly half of the world's oil reserves in the hands of Saddam.
It was not in American interest for someone like Saddam Hussein to get control of the energy reserves of the Persian Gulf.
August 6, 1990. Saudi Arabia. Defense Secretary Dick Cheney arrives to meet with Saudi leader King Fahd and other members of the royal family. Cheney's mission is to persuade the Saudi king to join forces with the U.S. Director of Saudi intelligence, Prince Turki Al Faisal, tells the final report about that initial meeting.
First of all, King Fahd explained his enormous feeling of deception by Saddam Hussein as having been stabbed in the back, because Saddam had reassured the king that there would be no invasion.
By invading Kuwait, Saddam has placed 100,000 troops within reach of the Saudi border.
Mr. Cheney showed intelligence, photographic and otherwise, that indicated the direction of Iraqi forces towards the border of Saudi Arabia.
Unknown to U.S. negotiators at the time, a leader from a fledgling Arab force has offered another option. It is a proposal for jihad, or holy war against Iraq. It is offered by a young Saudi named Osama bin Laden.
He went to officials and said to them that he would like to help repel the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait. And he was told, thank you very much for your kind offer, but we'll take care of the situation. Don't call us, we'll call you.
Saudi Arabia chooses to align with the United States. King Fahd also agrees to ask other Arab nations to join the coalition. How important was the coalition to the United States? The coalition was an essential factor in gaining military access and winning political approval.
If we could get a broad-based international coalition, it would be Saddam Hussein against the international community, not a cowboy action by the United States.
August 8th, 6 days after Saddam invades Kuwait, President Bush announces the deployment of U.S. troops to the Persian Gulf.
We must resist aggression, or it will destroy our freedoms.
Saddam envisions himself as a unifying force in the Arab region, but his invasion of Kuwait has set both Western and Arab nations against him.
He was a master of misjudgment. We had Syrian and Egyptian troops as a part of the coalition. It was the rest of the world against Iraq and Saddam Hussein.
August 17th, Saddam strikes back, rounding up hundreds of Westerners and their families stranded in Kuwait. He uses the men, women, and children as human shields against an attack. August 23rd, Saddam exchanges a few words with the captives before television cameras in an eerie attempt to spin worldwide media attention in his favor. The frightened hostages include a 5-year-old British boy named Stuart Lockwood.
Does Stuart get his milk?
Yes.
Are you getting your milk, Stuart?
Seeing the anxiety and even the terror in the faces of those, including the little boy whose head he patted at one point, I think really outraged people in a way that they had not been outraged previously.
November 29th, 1990. New York City. The UN Security Council passes Resolution 678. Iraq must leave Kuwait by January 15th, or the coalition reserves the right to use military force.
We were going to give him plenty of time, but the conditions were simple. Leave Kuwait unconditionally.
January 12, 1991. With the UN deadline less than a week away, the U.S. Senate debates and approves the offensive use of U.S. troops by a margin of 52 to 47. Meanwhile, Saddam fortifies the border of Kuwait and Iraq with his most capable Republican Guard forces. In Kuwait and along the Saudi border, Saddam deploys his massive army of conscripted soldiers, who are primarily Shia and Kurds. But did these soldiers affect the outcome of the war? Yes. Conscript soldiers surrendered in huge numbers, forcing Saddam to withdraw from Kuwait soon after the ground war began.
It was evident early on when the Iraqis surrendered in droves, first thousands, then tens of thousands, that they were undermotivated.
Why did so many of Saddam's soldiers surrender? Saddam left thousands of troops without leadership or provisions, and many of these soldiers weren't loyal to his regime. For a decade, Saddam and his Sunni-led government have victimized the Shia and Kurds. Many of Saddam's military officials are relatives and fellow tribesmen.
What happened is the Iraqis were just dead tired of being parked out in the desert with all the hardships that go with that, and then trying to defend a leader who would shoot them anyway.
For these troops, surrendering to Allied forces offered a better chance for survival.
The message was pretty consistent. Why sacrifice your lives for such a bad cause? If you give up, you'll be treated well.
With so many of Saddam's forces giving up, Allied troops moved swiftly to take out the elite Republican Guard. Why was it important to destroy the Republican Guard? They are Saddam's most loyal and best equipped forces.
There was a pecking order, if you will, of military forces, and Republican Guard were at the top. They reigned supreme as the chosen defender of Saddam more than Iraq.
U.S. strategy is to target the Republican Guard and destroy it, depriving Saddam of his power base. As loyal as Saddam's Republican Guard troops may be, they are still facing hundreds of thousands of Allied troops. In the face of such overwhelming force, how did Saddam expect to win the war? By weakening the coalition's resolve and destroying American public support for the war. Saddam believes that the American public won't tolerate a long and bloody war.
Turn protest into power!
Saddam fancied himself something of an expert on American psychology. He believed that the Americans had given up in Vietnam when casualties grew extreme, and that the Americans would fold once the casualties he was certain to inflict began to mount up.
Saddam's dream of a great victory did not materialize, but the U.S. also fell short of its goals.
I think it was one of the worst imaginable endings to this spectacular military victory.
That's next, in the conclusion of the final report. February 27th, 1991. Kuwait City. Day 4 of the ground assault against Iraqi forces. The liberation of Kuwait is nearly complete. Allied forces, in particular the Marines, have pushed into Kuwait with extraordinary speed.
The Marines did what they set out to do, and they pushed in fast. But instead of fixing the Iraqi forces, the Marines' attack acted a little bit like a piston. The Iraqis started to flee, or started to run away.
February 27th, 8 p.m. Riyadh, Saudi Arabia. After a 100-hour ground battle, General Schwarzkopf declared the Republican Guard cut off by Allied forces. But was the Republican Guard still a threat? Yes, because General Schwarzkopf's plan was not fully executed. Allied forces were still about 30 miles short of completing the left hook attack.
They really needed more time to cut off this army if they were to fulfill what was one of the primary goals of the operation, the destruction of the Republican Guard.
Washington, D.C. At the White House, the focus was not on U.S. troops cutting off the Republican Guard. The primary concern was the bombing Iraqis suffered earlier on the road that's known as the Highway of Death. What effect did the Highway of Death have on the U.S. war strategy? The highway bombing prompted the decision to end the war. The Bush administration worried that media coverage would cause a backlash.
We'd been so successful that there was a feeling then, as my Arab friend put it, like we were beating a tethered goat.
How would it seem if the Americans were in effect shooting the Iraqis in the back as they were fleeing? Would we be piling on?
The liberation of Kuwait was becoming the most one-sided war in U.S. history. Estimates were circulating that up to 100,000 Iraqis had been killed, including 200 civilians who died in the bombing of a shelter near Baghdad. Secretary of State James Baker recalls meeting with President Bush and other advisors in the Oval Office the day after the highway bombing.
We were killing Iraqis who were fleeing Kuwait up the so-called Highway of Death. The recommendation was unanimous that we'd accomplished what the UN resolution required of us, to eject Iraq from Kuwait.
That evening, 9 p.m., President Bush announced his proposal for a ceasefire. But was the ceasefire called too soon? To this day, military leaders dispute the answer.
We were glad to see the decision come. We were tired of war. There was never a question, had we done enough? Because we'd been told to get them out of Kuwait, and we'd done it.
But another key goal was not met. In a candid interview, retired General Barry McCaffrey tells the final report what he was unable to say at the end of the war.
At the time, I remained loyal to the chain of command. I really admire President Bush, one of my heroes. Having said that, it was a nonsensical decision. We should have completed the bagging of the Republican Guard force. Well, I think it was one of the worst imaginable endings to this spectacular military victory.
The ceasefire cut short McCaffrey's mission of trapping and destroying Saddam's Republican Guard.
To this day, I don't understand it, but the bottom line was we were stopped short of Basra. I think the gap was 40 or 50 kilometers through which there was an ability for the surviving Iraqi forces to get out of the pocket and escape back into Iraq.
After the ceasefire, thousands of Iraqi forces equipped with armored vehicles left Kuwait and southern Iraq. Many were Republican Guard troops. March 3rd, with Saddam's troops on the run, Shiite Muslims in southern Iraq formed a rebellion and took control of dozens of towns. In the mountains of the northeast, the Kurds followed with an insurgency of their own. The survival of Saddam's regime was now in doubt. Both factions believed that the American military would help them defeat Saddam's forces. Although President Bush urged the Iraqi population to stand up and overthrow Saddam, U.S. advisors assumed a coup would take place from within the Iraqi military.
President Bush clearly called upon them to throw off their shackles. They rose up. We were in close proximity to the millions of Shiite along the Euphrates River Valley, and we let them get slaughtered by Republican Guard troops and did not intervene.
Why didn't the U.S. support the uprisings? Because it wasn't part of the original war plan. By going after Saddam at that time, the U.S. would be overstepping their agreement with the Allied coalition. The U.S. military would also be left with the job of rebuilding a volatile nation.
There's nothing more messy than to militarily step into those sorts of situations with all these groups, civilians, local militias. It was just the sort of messy, ill-defined situation that you don't want to get involved with.
But despite heavy losses during the war, Saddam still had a substantial military arsenal. And more importantly, several of his loyal Republican Guard divisions were intact. These troops were still willing to fight for Saddam.
We left Saddam in power. It was a mistake that had consequences that in many ways led to the Second Gulf War.
April 15th, 1991, 6 weeks after the ceasefire, Saddam's troops crushed any threat to his rule. With Saddam still in power, what kind of victory did the First Gulf War achieve? Initially, the war was a diplomatic and military success, but it was not a long-term victory. American and Allied soldiers fought bravely, accomplishing the intended goal of the coalition, to liberate Kuwait. As the final report on the Gulf War shows, the battle was brief. 358 Allied soldiers died in the war. That compares to an estimated 10,000 to 50,000 Iraqi soldiers who were killed, and the estimated 1,000 to 3,500 Iraqi civilians who died. If the fighting had continued, thousands more Iraqis could have been killed.
We knew that this was in some ways a struggle off the battlefield. It was a struggle for the hearts and minds of the Arab world. We wanted to not simply win the military battle, but we wanted to win the aftermath.
But at the end of the war, a key element of the military strategy was incomplete. Saddam's Republican Guard stayed intact and slaughtered tens of thousands of Iraqis. More than a decade later, the final report finds the First Gulf War produced further unintended consequences. America's military presence in the Gulf in 1991 became a flashpoint among radical Muslims. A young Saudi named Osama bin Laden was enraged by the presence of American troops in his homeland. Bin Laden would use this anger as a basis for his holy war against America. A second unintended consequence stems from the decision to allow Saddam to stay in power. For 12 years, Saddam Hussein refused to cooperate with weapons inspectors seeking evidence of weapons of mass destruction. This violated the terms of the Gulf War peace agreement. In 2003, U.S. forces returned to Iraq, this time to remove the dictator from power. It's a job the United States chose to avoid in 1991.
The only thing I could say is that you might have been more moderately successful 15 years ago because you had 565,000 troops, not 130,000, and you might have been able to maintain stability. But how long would you be able to stay there politically? That's the question.
In 1991, the president was eager to bring the troops home as quickly as possible.
I think we did this one right. I think we did it right politically and diplomatically and militarily.
If we had gone in, we would have had the same situation that we have today, and we would be there for a long time. It's not as if we could have more easily effected regime change then than it is now.
None of us knows what would have taken his place. So even history, even 2020 hindsight, if you will, doesn't necessarily give you 2020 vision.
Desert Storm can be seen as a short war with lasting impact. It would take another war, longer, messier and deadlier, to remove Saddam from power and replace his regime with one that neither threatens its neighbors nor brutalizes its own people. The outcome of that conflict is still in doubt.